has written lots of best-selling books, and he is also a productivity expert. What is very unique about him is that he does very many experiments to see what he likes and what he doesn't like, and what works and what doesn't work. And today we're going to talk about 5 things that he often talks about. So the first thing would be that endurance is very important. On his podcast, Ferriss once interviewed an extremely successful obstacle racer, the most decorated in history, Amelia Boone. In this episode, she said, "The reason why I'm this successful isn't because I'm the toughest or the fastest, but simply that I'm really good at suffering." And Tim Ferriss agrees that being disciplined can be very useful, but it's only very useful if you're using it for something that is worth suffering for. Otherwise, it's just simply making your life painful for nothing. And then the second thing he often talks about would be fear setting, which he does instead of goal setting. He thinks that we shouldn't only have specific goals, because you've probably heard about the SMART goal, that they should be specific, but we should also write down specifically what we are afraid of. Because once we have defined that, once we know what we are really afraid of, then we become more familiar to that fear, and everything that becomes more familiar tends to be less scary for us. What's very interesting, Vanessa Van Edwards once mentioned, in a study in which participants were scared, as soon as they actually labelled what they were feeling, or just that what they were feeling afraid, their amygdala actually went quiet as soon as they admitted to themselves that they were afraid. And what's also good about fear setting, it's not only about writing down what you're afraid of, but, and this is maybe even the more important thing, it's also writing down what you are going to do in case that worst case scenario actually does happen. And then you can actually be optimistic by being pessimistic. So basically you can be optimistic about the fact that when things do go wrong, you know exactly how to handle it because you've already thought about it beforehand. And then the third thing he often talks about is that he often asks himself, what would this look like if it was easy? Because we tend to overcomplicate things, and that very often also leads to procrastination. And also, being productive isn't necessarily just doing the most work in the least amount of time. That alone would just be being busy. Being productive means that you do the most important, the most useful work in the least amount of time. So basically to find the most effective way, to find the way in which it is the easiest. On his podcast he also had Peter Thiel on, and one thing he said is that he always asks himself how he could reach his 10-year plan in 6 months. Now of course this is very unrealistic, but what this exercise actually helps you do is to make it as easy as possible, and that's why it's so effective. And then the fourth thing is that, even though it sounds very contradictory, that if we want to achieve a lot, we want to make sure that we have low expectations. Because if we have low expectations, it makes it easier for us to start, and it makes us less perfectionistic. And perfectionism very often is the very thing that makes us not start, because we overthink about how we're going to do this perfectly instead of actually taking action. And this is the very reason why James Clear's 2-minute rule, so basically taking anything you want to do, any habit you want to implement, and just telling yourself that you're going to just do it for 2 minutes, because that way, if you tell yourself that you're going to exercise for an hour, you're going to feel like, oh no, I'm not going to do that. I'd rather stay at home and watch Netflix. I think we've all been there. But if we just say, okay, I'm going to just exercise for 2 minutes and then see how I feel, and if I feel like I could do more, I'll continue, that lowers the bar, and we feel like, okay, I suppose I could do that, even if I'm feeling very, very bad. Even if I'm feeling very lazy right now. And what's very great about the 2-minute rule is that usually starting is the most difficult part of the process. But once we've gotten started, we notice that it isn't as difficult as we imagined. And then we often tend to continue even though we didn't necessarily intend to. And back when the IBM used to be this undefeatable sales process, what was very interesting is that their quotas actually were the lowest in the industry, not the highest. They actually had the lowest expectations, and that's why they did so well, because they didn't overthink and try to be perfect, and because they weren't punished for doing something that wasn't as good, and therefore they could actually get more done. On another episode of his podcast with Neil Strauss, who is this incredible writer, Neil Strauss said, in his opinion, there's no such thing as writer's block. All writer's block really is, according to Neil Strauss, is performance anxiety. And the way to actually decrease this performance anxiety is to have low expectations. And also Shaun White, one of the greatest snowboarders in history, if not the greatest. Before he actually does the Olympics, what he does, and this is very interesting, most people would think, okay, this is important, I really have to get this, I really need to do this well. But instead, just to relieve the pressure and therefore be able to perform better, what he says before he skateboards at the Olympics is tell himself, who cares? And this then causes less anxiety. This is very important if you want to perform at your best in a very high pressure situation. Because in a high pressure situation, you're probably already anxious enough. And just telling yourself how important this thing is just going to make you feel even more anxious. And when it comes to stress, there's this U-curve at which our performance is the best when we have not no stress at all, but a moderate amount of stress that isn't too much. So you want to make sure that you're not too anxious if you want to perform well. And that is because in a flow state, the state in which we perform our best, the PFC actually completely shuts down. And the prefrontal cortex is the very brain region that often makes us overthink, makes us anxious. And then the fifth tip would be that you want to make sure that you practice discomfort and courage in small ways to prepare for when it's actually important, for when it actually does matter, when the stakes are high. Because it's very unlikely that in those important situations you're actually going to be courageous if you haven't practiced when the stakes weren't as high. Now, if you want to hear advice from another person who also has a podcast and who also is very much into productivity and also has a podcast, you can watch this video on Tom Bilyeu's advice here.